Hello there, art nerds, and happy holidays. So today we are working on our fourth Christmas themed Stashbuster watercolor tutorial, and I'm going to show you guys how to paint some festive jingle bells in watercolor. Don't worry, it's a lot easier than it looks. So grab your paints, grab your brushes, and let's get painting. So the materials you'll need for today's watercolor tutorial are a scrap of watercolor paper, a piece of chipboard, some masking artist tape, some masking fluid, and I'm using removable masking fluid today. You're also going to need some gold watercolor, gold ink. I'm using Winsor & Newton's gold ink. You're also going to need some watercolors, preferably your favorite watercolors, as well as assorted watercolor brushes. I prefer to use rounds. You guys will find a list of the materials that you need down in the description below, so make sure you check that description. So first off, I am taping my piece of watercolor paper. It's a scrap, about bookmark shape, but you could do this as a postcard or as a tag or as a gift card. And I'm taping it down to my chipboard. Next, I am sketching out some circular shapes and adding in some ribbons. And don't worry, I'm going to zoom in so you guys can see it a little bit better in a moment. But for this one, feel free to add as much detail as you want or keep it as simple as you like. It can be as simple as just little round bells. Once I have everything kind of sketched out, I'm going to go in and tighten up my pencils and really kind of commit to what I'm looking for. And I'm still keeping it kind of used. I'm actually using an HB lead for this, partially because the softer, darker leads do have a bit of a tendency to smear when you add water on top of them, and I don't want that to happen. I'm also going to use an eraser and just kind of clean up my lines. So today I am painting on Stonehenge Aqua. I'm trying to use up the scraps that I have stashed. I'm a bit of an art supply hoarder, and I'm trying to use up what I've got, so hopefully this series will inspire you guys to do the same. And if you're new here, I have some other Stashbuster tutorials I think you're really going to enjoy. I will say though, I recommend you don't use Stonehenge Aqua if you're going to be using as much masking fluid as we're using today. I keep trying it and it keeps not working out for me. It keeps tearing up the paper. So do as I say, not necessarily as I do. I'm using a synthetic watercolor brush with some brush soap worked into the bristles, and I am masking out the bells as well as their ribbons. And this is going to allow me to do a really loose wet into wet background. But as I mentioned earlier, Stonehenge Aqua is not really the best paper if you're using a lot of masking fluid. Even if you're being careful and you're using removable masking fluid, even if you allow the masking fluid to dry completely before you paint on top of it and then completely again before you remove it, I just haven't had the best experiences with Stonehenge and masking fluid. But this is why we do these kind of watercolors. It allows us to figure out what works with and what doesn't work with other products that we have, so that we can figure out what materials to grab in what situation. And I still found a way to salvage it, as you guys will see as we continue painting. So I allowed that to dry completely, totally, and fully. And for my background, I'm doing a series of 3 granulating blues. You can use whatever colors you want for this. I just thought the blues and the gold tones would be super pretty. I'm starting out with a really light pastel blue. It's a vetiver blue, and then I'm going to mix in some ultramarine blue, and then I'm going to mix in some smalt blue, and then finally I'm going to use a little bit of urban blue violet. But like I said, You can use whatever colors you like. You don't have to go with golden bells. You can go with silver bells. You don't have to go with red ribbons. You can go with green ribbons. You can use whatever colors mean holidays to you, or just whatever colors you want for this. So I'm working wet into wet, and I'm applying my new colors before the other one has a chance to dry, and that encourages the colors to kind of intermix and to granulate out, and that's going to give us some really pretty effects without a whole lot of effort. And this is why we used the masking fluid, because it allowed us to cover these big areas and get almost like a tie-dye effect. I'm also going to use a little bit of white paint. I have white gouache here, and I'm going to splatter it onto the background just to kind of give the impression of snow. Next, I'm going to use a masking fluid pickup. This is one that I got at Dollar Tree, so they're pretty affordable, to start working my masking fluid loose so that I can peel it off and remove it. And as you guys can see, it's really adhering to the paper. For some reason, masking fluid just wants to permanently bond with Stonehenge. But a little bit of patience and a little bit of elbow grease, and we're able to get our masking fluid off our illustration. And as you guys can see, it reserved those areas so that we can paint them. I'm doing a little bit of cleanup using some clean water, a brush, and a paper towel just to lift up some of that blue that's in an area where I don't want it to be. And I am starting out with kind of an Indian yellow as our base color. So even though we are going to be using metallic colors later on, I wanted to make sure that not only did I get a good base, because some of them are not that opaque, but to also demonstrate how to paint the bells normally in case you don't have metallic watercolors or you don't want to use metallic watercolors. So while Indian yellow is still wet, I'm going in with a more saturated straight from the pan variation and working it in circles wet into wet. I allowed it to dry a little bit so that it's not sopping wet, and then I'm going in with a Quin Gold to really build up that color. Finally, I'm using a little bit of burnt sienna, and I'm applying it towards the bottom of the bells to create the impression of a shadow. I'm spritzing my watercolors to reactivate them since I gave everything a bit of a chance to dry. And now I'm going in with some of my darker browns to really start painting some of the shadows on the bells. And I'm working in kind of like a circular motion with a little bit of a crescent around the shadow, just to kind of give that sort of brassy, shiny brass look that you see bells often have. Now I'm going to start painting the ribbons, and I thought red ribbons would be really pretty with these. So I'm using quinacridone red, which is almost like a candy red sort of color, and I'm painting in the main body of the bows. You can leave a bit of a highlight if you want to, but since my paper got so chewed up by my masking fluid, I want to cover everything as much as possible and hide those mistakes as much as I can. After that dried, I noticed that my bells just didn't have as much gold to them as I wanted. So I'm reactivating my Indian yellow, and I'm applying another layer wet over dry on top of our bells. You guys also saw me use the masking fluid pickup to pick up some stray masking fluid that I missed the first time, sometimes it's easier to notice the areas you've missed once you've applied an initial wash, and then you can really see where it's kind of resisting your color. So now I'm going in with alizarin crimson, and this is where I'm trying to do a bit of brush work and leave some highlights so that the ribbon looks like a red satin ribbon. But I am also trying to cover up and adjust those areas that got chewed up by the masking fluid. So hopefully you'll be able to do a better job with this than I am. But this is one of the reasons I really like painting with round watercolor brushes, is they're just good all-rounders and you can really lean heavily on them for expressive brush work. I'm using silver black velvet watercolor brushes today. You guys will see these come up in a lot of my watercolor tutorials. I just think they are generally very good watercolor brushes for the price. And you guys can see I'm leaving a little bit of that initial wash color visible. It looks so much lighter once you apply a second layer to it. And that gives the impression of light hitting our ribbon and reflecting off of it. Once that had a chance to dry, I'm going in with an even more saturated version of our alizarin crimson, and I've switched over to a smaller round watercolor brush, and I'm covering far less of the ribbon because we really want to give the impression of light and shadow on this ribbon. We want it to read as a satin ribbon, and that means we need to have some really bright highlights as well as some much darker and richer lowlights. And switching over to a smaller watercolor brush allows us to work a little bit more nimbly and to get in there and do those smaller details. Generally, you want to work with the largest watercolor brush that you're comfortable with using, and that'll help prevent your watercolors from getting too muddy. For the ribbon, I've been mostly working wet over dry so that we can get those really crisp color delineations rather than the softer blends we get when we do wet into wet. So I'm working with some naphthalide maroon mixed in with our alizarin crimson, and that's kind of giving us this darker, richer color that we're using to add in even more shadows to our red ribbons. To complete the bells, if you weren't going to be using a metallic watercolor, we're going in with a sepia brown and we're painting in the little crosshair opening, and I've added like a little heart detail to the openings, and I'm using a much smaller watercolor brush for this. So if you have metallic watercolors, now is a good time to pull them out. I'm using Winsor & Newton's gold ink, and this actually has little particles of bronze in it, which is going to give us a really nice metallic finish. So we're going to be painting this over the bells, and you guys can see how just metallic this ink is. And I'm using a larger brush, and I'm basically going to cover up everything I just did. And the plus side to that is it's slightly translucent, so you will still see some of that color and some of that detail, but we are going to have to paint on top of this to add the details back in. You could opt to just paint your bells with gold initially, but I wanted to demonstrate two different ways of handling the bells, if you have the metallic watercolors and if you don't have metallic watercolors. Now, you can build up the metallicness, the metallic properties of this if you allow it to dry, and then paint subsequent layers. But I did want to utilize a little bit of that translucency. So after you've let it dry, we're going to go in with some of our quinacridone gold, and we're going to start adding in, Indian yellow, and we're going to go in and start adding in some shadows on top of it. We're going to glaze this color on it. Now you want to be kind of careful because you can reactivate that gold ink a bit and it will lift up somewhat. So we're kind of playing a balancing act between adding detail and removing the metallic properties. But I'm basically just replicating what I did earlier on top of the gold, and it gives us kind of a rich golden appearance. After I've allowed that to dry, I can go in and paint our center opening. At this point, we're basically done. We're basically just going to be kind of finessing things, cleaning things up, adding additional shadows, adding additional details. So it really depends on what you want. I've mixed in some purple with my naphthalide maroon, and I'm painting in some darker shadows on our ribbon so that we can get more contrast and so that it'll really feel like it's reflecting that light. And once you've finished finessing it and it's had a chance to dry, I'm going to pull out my white gouache to add my final details. So basically, I'm adding some small highlights to the bell and to the ribbon. I'm doing a little bit of like a corkscrew sort of highlight just because it's kind of whimsical. And I'm working with a smaller round watercolor brush. Now, if you're not used to working with gouache, you may want to work with a stiffer synthetic watercolor brush similar to what you might use to apply your masking fluid, just because it's not going to be as soft. It's going to provide a little bit more resistance and you're going to be able to pull finer lines with it. And at this point, we're just about done. There's just a couple more things that I want to do. So I'm going to use the white gouache and I'm going to flick it over our watercolor illustration one more time so that we get a little bit of the snow in the foreground as well. And I used to squirt my gouache out onto my palette and work from there, but I was wasting a lot of gouache, so I am just very lazy, and I dip a clean brush with clean water into the gouache tube itself because I basically just use white gouache for highlights and for accents. I don't really use gouache a whole lot, but you don't have to use white gouache for this. Any white paint should work pretty well. You could also use a gel pen if you'd like. So we let it dry totally, and then we carefully peel away our masking tape. Look at those lines. They turned out so good. And here is our finished Jingle Bells bookmark. This would be very cute as a gift tag. It'd be cute as a card. It would be super cute as a postcard. So hopefully you'll take some inspiration from today's Stashbuster tutorial and get to painting. This one requires very minimal drawing skills. That's the whole point of my Stashbuster series. And if you're looking for more easy watercolor tutorials, I've got some great playlists for you guys that I'll link down in the description below. I hope you guys enjoyed painting with me today. I sure enjoyed painting with you guys. Tutorials like this are made possible thanks to my amazing patrons on Patreon. Thank you guys so much for all that you do and for all your encouragement and support. It really, really means a lot to me. If you guys would like to support what I'm doing here on the channel, you can join me at patreon.com/natosoup and get early access to many of my videos that I release here on the channel. So I hope you guys feel inspired to go pick up a paintbrush and paint today, and hopefully I've given you some ideas for what to paint. Thank you guys so much and have a wonderful day.